Welcome to the Six M's of Manufacturing podcast. I'm your host, Adrienne Temple. You might have used AI to gussy up an email before sending it to key contacts or even leveraged it for research. But where does AI fit in the world of manufacturing? In this episode, Cameron Duncan, co-founder and CEO of Hallian Technologies, spills the tea on AI and business intelligence. You do not want to miss this episode. Let's get started. Cameron, first of all, thanks so much for joining us today. I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of share a little bit of your background because you've worked in manufacturing before and then kind of went out on your own and now you're doing some things with AI. So just kind of share with the audience kind of what your background is and how you got where you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Adrienne. Happy to be here. I've spent 14 years in manufacturing. Up until starting this company, Hallian Technologies, all I did was manufacturing. I started at a company called Gestamp in Union, South Carolina. Are you familiar with Gestamp? They're a tier one automotive supplier. They're a Spanish company, and they have a few different branches, but primarily they were a BMW supplier. And in that role, I really cut my teeth doing supplier quality engineering. So I spent about 3 years at Gestamp doing all types of roles. I was the only supplier quality engineer on site. And so I learned a lot through that. And that was my first taste of what high production manufacturing could be. So Gestamp did Class A parts for like BMW and Mercedes. Think body sides, roofs, doors, hoods, like all that type of stuff. And then I went to work at GE. So I worked at GE for also about 2.5 years or 3 years in a similar capacity, supplier quality engineering. And then I went to work at Proterra, and I stayed at Proterra for 7 years. And at Proterra, I did a bunch of different roles. Customer program manager, which is a customer facing project manager position. So working directly with clients, I was really like the focal point for any customer query. And then I managed the project internally and externally for what we were doing for them. And Proterra is an EV bus manufacturer, or that's what it started as. It's since diversified into a few different places. And I did that role for a while, and then I got on the operations side at Proterra. So effectively building a project management office for the Proterra organization. And then I moved over to the chief of staff position for the president, which then became the chief operating officer at the company. So my world was supply chain, manufacturing, operations, inventory, IT, some aspects of the engineering team, quality. Yeah, so I got a really good perspective of what it takes to run a large manufacturing operation.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, no sweat, right? No sweat, no problem. That's like nothing.
Yeah, no, it was, I learned a lot. I actually talk about my experience as chief of staff as a real life MBA. That's really what it felt like. You can go to school for it, but until you actually see it, it's both more complex and messier and more rewarding than you would ever have expected just studying it in class.
Yeah. So what got you into this whole AI space?
Well, I founded the company with my partner, who's a developer, and when we jumped into business, we
Mhm.
decided we were a shop that did data. So we did data warehousing, data lakes, built business intelligence reports on top of it. So just think Power BI or Tableau. That's the type of work that we did. We also did custom applications for businesses specifically, not mobile apps, but we would go in and if a client needed some help designing something, they couldn't exactly find it off the shelf. That's the type of work that we did. So, but when we started the business, we knew that we wanted to build something to take to market. And we both were very, very interested in the power of generative AI. And then we just started putting together puzzle pieces that we didn't think other people were putting together at the time. That's really what launched it. It was when we found how powerful it could be for organizations so we just kind of went all in on it. And now our company, all we do is generative AI enterprise grade deployments.
Yeah, see, that's something that I really want to dig into because I know there's this, broader conversation that's happening, especially broad scale, chat GPT. And I know that's not the only one, but let's just say that's what a lot of people are talking about. They're using it, at a personal level for streamlining their work, being able to pull in different information so that they can write reports or, even from a marketing standpoint, they can put together some things that are meaningful based on data they have. Deeper level in manufacturing, I think sometimes like putting it together, how would AI really fit in a manufacturing, how would a manufacturing organization leverage that? I think that's a really big question right now. Is that something that you can kind of dig into a little bit more just based on what you guys have been doing and what your experience level has been with that?
Yes, I think we can spend effectively this entire podcast talking about that, and I'm happy to. I'm happy to. AI has been in manufacturing for a very long time, but on the machine learning side. So when I talk about machine learning, the simple example is a vision system. Most people in manufacturing are pretty familiar with the vision system. So
Mhm.
you take a picture of a part as it rolls down an assembly line, and then over time, after a quality inspector looks at it and says the part is good or bad, if you do that enough times and you're feeding that back into a machine learning system, eventually the vision system gets pretty good at saying this part is good and this part is bad. Now, whether or not it doesn't really know why it's good or bad. It just knows when I see something like this, based off of my training data, I know that this is good and bad. The same thing happens with predictive maintenance or any of these other things inside of in the manufacturing space. Generative AI is different. So I would say that in the manufacturing world, there's been a huge amount of focus on lean, so eliminating waste. But primarily, it's been focused around lean on the actual operation side. So making parts. Does that make
That's
sense?
fair.
There is so much that happens inside of an organization that builds things that's not exactly like manufacturing the parts. So
Mhm.
I mentioned a few, right? So there's supply chain. There's so many aspects of operations. So just like manufacturing engineering or inventory management or all these things that they all eventually funnel to the manufacturing line, but there's spaces, the engineering that supports it. All of that stuff is necessary to build parts, and there is an enormous amount of waste in those organizations. Not necessarily like people waste, but like you spend time searching for information. And the simplest way to think about how AI can, generative AI specifically, maybe we should define that term. Should we define that term?
I think so, just for people that are not as familiar with this, like, what does that really mean?
Yeah. So generative AI, I actually have a definition of it. I'm gonna pull it up because the definition really matters. Give me a second. So it's a type of artificial intelligence that creates new content. That's really what we're talking about. So that can be text, it can be images, it can be code for like developers, it can
Mhm.
be even music. You can have AI generated music, you can have AI generated video. That's becoming very popular, and it learns from existing data to understand the patterns of how these things work to create new content. So it's still a prediction machine, similar to how machine learning is a prediction machine, but it's a prediction machine using something like text. So it's generating content. It's giving you the ability to build an engineering report or create a DFMEA from scratch based off of learning training data that it had access to previously, or create checklists for a maintenance team. So they don't have to create it from scratch. They can start from information that's been put into the system. So that's what I
Okay.
mean by generative AI. It is that we can use ChatGPT as shorthand for like what the capabilities are, because a lot of people are familiar with ChatGPT. And when people think about ChatGPT, it's an individual tool typically. And so people get interested in it because they're like, hey, it helps me write emails faster, or it helps me summarize enormous amounts of information really, really quickly. But what I'm interested in is how does that move towards the organizational level? How can you harness that power not only at the individual level, but at the macro level of the organization, and have it trickle down to the individual users of those systems?
So with Chat GPT, because probably something else we need to kind of talk about, because when we're talking about organizational data, obviously the sensitivity of data is a really big deal, especially right now. Just again, cybersecurity, compromising a lot of IP, things like that. Like a Chat GPT versus kind of what you're talking about is generative AI inside an organization, like creating that engineering report or that maintenance checklist. What's the difference in this, like the source data? Like, is Chat GPT open source? Like it comes from everywhere, it's available, it's pulling from data that's out there, or you know what I mean? Just compare and contrast those two so we kind of understand where that data is coming from and where it's housed.
Okay, I'm going to do my best not to get hyper technical here. So, ChatGPT is a large language model. It's actually an app on top of it. So there's a bunch of things that ChatGPT does, but at its base, it's a large language model, or an LLM. That's the
Mhm.
acronym that most people use. And there's thousands of these at this point, right? So the Google has their own, Meta from Facebook has it. There's a ChatGPT competitor called Anthropic. DeepSeek is that Chinese company that made huge waves, but all of them are large language models that have come out. And the large language model is trained on a specific set of data, typically from the internet. So they
Okay.
scraped huge swaths of the internet. We're talking about like billions and billions of articles, and they put them all together, they curated it, and then they used machine learning techniques and deep learning techniques to make it so it understands the context of human language and it can respond in that way. But that's what they're all based off of. So if you're talking directly to a large language model like ChatGPT, it's using its training data based off of what the corpus of information that was included inside of that training data. And so when you think about it from an organizational standpoint, that model knows effectively nothing about the organization other than what it was able to learn off of the internet. And that's important. And it's important because the most things that actually matter to organizations, these tools don't know. So it doesn't know your customer base. It doesn't know your vendors. It doesn't know your strategy. It doesn't know your internal pricing. It doesn't know any of that stuff, right? It doesn't know anything about your manufacturing lines. And so what we specialize in and what we help organizations do is figure out how to take this basic model, these basic technology like the large language model, and then
Mhm.
apply it to your business so it actually knows things about your business while protecting the security of your data. And I'm happy to get into that as well. Because I know a lot of people have questions about how is this actually safe?
Yeah, I do think that comes up because people are so hesitant to really put a lot of information out there. Because I mean, you think about it, your bread and butter comes from, your secret sauce is a lot of those things. Oh, this is how we operate. This is what our strategy is. This is what we're gonna do, right? We don't want to have that compromised in any way. So I guess it probably is very appropriate to touch on how you keep that secure if you're going to start leveraging that internal intelligence, and share it with an AI large language model. What does that look like from a protection of data and IP from your perspective?
Well, so there's three ways to do it. The first is if an organization doesn't have sensitive data that they want to include with these models, there
Mhm.
are off-the-shelf solutions that are software as a service that you can use. You could actually even use a lot of organizations that are on the smaller side will use something like ChatGPT or one of their competitors, and they will upload data that's maybe not sensitive, or they don't really mind if it's out there for public consumption, and they will use that and make it so that they can, for example, like you could upload a bunch of equipment details. So if you have documents that have data about how equipment actually functions, you could upload those big technical manuals to a
Mhm.
system and have it and use off-the-shelf tools to do that. Okay, so that's the first way that you can do it. Use off-the-shelf tool, potentially less secure. Then you can do a private deployment. So you can create your own internal system that has all of your data housed locally, either in your own cloud or on premises, like in a physical file server. And you can have that there, and then still do some type of API call securely to these large language models to augment it with that. Or the third option is having a fully internal. So a lot of these models are now open source, and and what I mean by open source is that you can download them onto a server and then have a fully contained system inside of your organization that never even needs to touch the internet. That is also possible. It's also more expensive than the other options.
Yeah, I'm sure definitely starting there might not be feasible for everybody, but it sounds at least there's different scalable options based on where you are. It's just how much data security really matters with what you're doing, right?
100%. 100%.
Yeah. So, from your perspective, looking at maybe some of the use cases, for a manufacturer, what are some things that commonly they might start leveraging this sort of generative AI for? Like you said, there's lots of support processes that nobody sees, right? There's all these folks behind the curtain that make it happen, and there's all this information coming in and going out. But what are some typical use cases that you're seeing when they're starting to create the use case for AI in general for an organization?
Why don't we just do an example? Let's just talk about one team. So I already mentioned
Sure.
maintenance. Why don't we just talk about maintenance? So maintenance organizations, they might have a tool like MaintainX, or maybe they have their own systems that they use internally. But typically there's something that manages work orders and all the work that they've done on various parts of their line. And then there are maintenance manuals or equipment manuals that they have usually in like either on like a file server, or they have it even printed out in a binder. And typically what I see is something breaks on a line and then they deploy a maintenance tech, right? The
Mhm.
maintenance technician goes out and they try to figure out what's going on. And that takes time. And the equipment is down for, let's say it's down for an hour. Probably the first 15 to 30 minutes of that time, they're really just trying to figure out what's wrong and then what should I do about it. So they're either on the radio and they're calling people and saying, hey, I have this issue. I haven't dealt with this before. Do you know what's going on? So they're relying on organizational expertise. So maybe there's somebody that has seen this problem before. And if they don't have that, then they're digging through these manuals to try to figure out what's going on. That's just time. And the reason I like talking about maintenance is because it's directly related to, it's easy to quantify, right? Most organizations know how much downtime costs them. And what you can do with generative AI on the maintenance side is create an AI assistant for the maintenance team. So imagine you have the ability to connect all of your work orders. So you have your work order history on every single piece of equipment. You can also have access to all of the maintenance manuals, and you put all of that into one place, and then also give it a description of how does this line actually function. So what's the piece of equipment? Where does it live on the line? It can have all that information. And then when you have an issue, you can quickly figure out what the right thing to do is. You could type in, hey, I have this equipment that's breaking. It's overheating in this way. And these are the other things that I'm seeing. Can you recommend troubleshooting guidelines to what I should do? And if you can just shrink the amount of time that it takes to figure out what's going on, and then also shrink the amount of time to figure out what you should do about it, then that's a huge win. If you can decrease the amount of downtime by just 10%, I mean, it pays for itself in like 3 months. So that's the type of thing that an AI assistant can do on the maintenance side of things. And it's all about speed to information. It's how
Mhm.
quickly can you get to the right answer.
So let's dig into that because this is
Yeah.
I love this topic, and I've seen this firsthand, so that's why it's close to my heart. So we have a lot of different folks who may have a CMMS, and kind of that's been my experience. The value of good data when
Mhm.
you're going to start going towards, and I'll give you an example, but like kind of going towards this leveraging of AI, which I love because a lot of times the troubleshooting is the hardest part, and you have people of different experience levels that have no context of what's happened in the past, what's a frequent failure that we see. I mean, they don't have that. So having access to it would be amazing. But one of the things I've run into personally in my own experience is the collection of our data for a CMMS and saying this is the failure code, this is the reason why it failed or what happened gets lost. It becomes very, just to a point that we kind of pick something and move on. We're really not using the data as an opportunity to start pointing in a certain direction. How important with beyond maintenance, but how important is that when you look at your data collection and meaningful data if you're going to go with leveraging an AI model like this?
Super important. It's super important. There's a guy that I love his stuff. His name's Seth Early. He actually wrote a book on enterprise AI back in the day. It was inspirational to me in a lot of ways. And he has a term that he says all the time, and it's there's no AI without IA. And what he means is there's no artificial intelligence without information architecture. Okay. So what he's really saying is that the AI tools are only as good as the underlying data. And I believe this to be true. Not everybody agrees with that. So let me give you an example. I got to sit in on an AI workshop, I don't know, like 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, with a guy from San Francisco. So he's an investor. He invested in a lot of machine learning companies that are building really interesting AI stuff. And his perspective, and I asked this question directly because I was supporting a client. And I said, hey, what do you advise on the data collection side and data curation side in order for this technology to be useful to them? And his perspective was, you don't have to worry about it because AI will take care of that as well. Just like dump all the data in and let it figure it out. I couldn't disagree with that more. So based off of my own personal experience of actually building these solutions for like real companies, the information curation side is probably the most important thing in order for these things to work well. Because in a business context, it's not only important for the responses to be quick and fast, which is important, but it has to be accurate. The only way for businesses to be confident that it's going to be accurate is to be very careful on the curation of the data that goes into the tools. So what we advise our clients is that it's not going to happen in a month, 2 months, 3 months. This is a long-term project. And so starting small, starting with a small project that's not the heaviest lift in the world is really important, because then the business starts to see the value of what it can do. We've talked for a long time in the IT world, and anybody that's been in information technology and manufacturing has always said, like, hey, data is the new oil, right? Have you heard that? I'm sure you've heard that,
Yeah.
Adrian. Data
Yep.
is the new oil. And like, I feel like that's been preached since the dawn of like the idea of Industry 4.0. I would say that not many companies have taken that seriously, mostly because it's really hard work and it's really tough to see the fruits of that labor.
Mhm.
But my belief is that as organizations start more and more to see how powerful this can be, if you have good data, it becomes very obvious that you need to actually take care and create strong data governance systems, actually really take seriously, where are we putting our data? Are we throwing it into a data lake? Are we then warehousing that data in a way that makes sense so we can then leverage it with the incredibly powerful technology that exists today? I actually think we'll start seeing a lot of organizations really start to take it seriously once they start doing some of the basic simple use cases like that maintenance assistant. Then they'll start saying like, oh wow, well, we could leverage it over here too, but we know we have some data work to do. So let's go ahead and do that data work. So now we can build things on top of that and have confidence in our information.
As a starting point, I mean, talking about data, and we primarily focus on like the small to medium sized manufacturers because we know
Mhm.
some of the large ones obviously have lots and lots of data and it's readily accessible, right? I mean, they have access to those types of things. But let's look at someone who may or may not have their data where it's highly accessible to like a system to refer to. So you still got people that do production reports in Excel, right? Goes nowhere, maybe on their intranet, but it's not actually in a system or a database or a data warehouse by any means. From your perspective, do you think if you are in that position where maybe you've got a CMMS or maybe you've got some data around your sourcing or you've got some systems that you're leveraging, is that the best place to start? And if it is, what are the things that you look at just to make sure that you feel like you've got good data, right? Because I know you can't just make that jump from like Excel spreadsheets to now I'm using AI to go back and look at my production reports and tell me where a lot of these things are happening. But for those people that maybe have some systems and they want to start in that place where they have a system where there's data readily available, when you look at that with a critical eye, what would you say? Hey, this is really what we need to make sure that our data is good here in these ways before we start jumping to trying to query it. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. When I teach this stuff, I typically teach it in imagine you have an x-axis, and that x-axis is return on investment. So it's how much bang for the buck are you getting out of this particular deployment of this AI use case, and then on the y-axis you have how heavy of a lift is it, like how hard is it to do. What you really want are the things that are, especially early, you want the easiest stuff that gives you the most bang for the buck. And when you start connecting systems, those are typically heavier lift opportunities. You can do it, it's just harder to do. So you mentioned a lot of organizations have production reports that are
Mhm.
in Excel spreadsheets. That's actually no problem. I would advise organizations to just use what they have. If it's Excel spreadsheets or they have PDFs or they have PowerPoints, generative AI works incredibly well on unstructured data. So you can actually upload, say you have 2 years worth of production data, but it's in Excel, no problem. I would actually recommend that instead of trying to connect it directly to a system that is pumping out information on a regular basis, because it's easier to do, and there also is pretty good returns for that type of thing. And then you start understanding the technology better, and then you can jump into, okay, well, let's connect it to live data. How do we actually do that? It would be really good to do that, and then you start getting into data warehousing. It just becomes more complex. But yeah, there's no problem with using an Excel spreadsheet as long as the data in the Excel spreadsheet is accurate.
Okay. That's good to know because I think a lot of people will make the assumption that you have to kind of be a little bit further along. And some of that might be coming from that industry 4.0, like the smart factory and everything is integrated and everything's talking and everything's reporting back and it's real time data. So I think that might really be a misnomer for a lot of people that I can't leverage the way that I function now, which again, we still see, a prevalence of manufacturers that use a lot of data collection through basic Excel reports, in a lot of different areas besides operations. But it sounds like this is not so out of reach for them if that's where they're starting from.
Yeah, if we go back to the matrix idea, right? So you have the ROI and then how
Hmm.
challenging it is. Each one of these, it doesn't all happen overnight. It's
Right.
really done with individual projects. And so you want to take the simplest projects to do that drive your return and then learn from that and then grow because you build your muscle over time. But you don't need to have a North Star direction, but you don't need to have a grand vision of everything you're going to do. Really, you just need to be able to see, like, I know I'm going that way and I can see the next barrel as we like go walk through the desert. I can see what that next thing is, but you don't need to have super connected systems in order to get started
No,
necessarily.
that's I think that's great then because that means that people have more opportunity to
Mhm.
leverage it and use the business intelligence without being fully connected and having everything in place because that's a long-term goal and that can
Yeah,
also
sir.
be very expensive. From that perspective, I guess when you talk about having that North Star, what are some of the driving motivations behind people that are starting to leverage the generative AI in their organization? Is there a specific thing that's really causing them to take that next step from what you've seen?
It's usually efficiency.
Okay.
They typically when we talk to someone, they have some type of pain. So maybe it's on. So we work with a lot of with engineers, and engineers uh, are, let's see how to say this. They don't like doing like, so there's some important things that have to happen inside of an engineering function. So not only do they need to do whatever design is and they need to support manufacturing, all that stuff's critical and important, but they also need to document their work, right? So they have to write a report that says why they did what they did, or they need to, I mentioned DFMEAs earlier, but you need to write these things down, and it's hard work and it
Mhm.
takes time for people to do it. And I've never met a single engineer that's like, you know what I love doing? I love writing reports. It's my favorite thing to do and I live for it. I've never heard an engineer say that. They usually are like, hey, we know what's important, but we never feel like we have the time to do it in the right way. And so there's a lot of ways that you can leverage the technology to help assist in building those things like that. So if there's a particular way that you want to document your engineering designs or create technical specifications that then flows down to your manufacturing engineers or right, you
Mhm.
can leverage the technology in a way to not kind of increase the efficiency of those tools, but like increasing the efficiency by 80 to 90%. Can you automate the first draft of a report for a 14-page technical document and then have the engineer just go back and modify it really quickly? Instead of it taking 10 hours to write that, you can do it in an hour. Truly do it in an hour. That's where we see like a huge, and that's also beneficial because it doesn't require connecting to systems typically, right? You're feeding it past information, typically in the form of like an Excel sheet or PDFs or PowerPoints. And then you utilize that to create new content that can then be leveraged and actually fed back into the system. But it gives you same thing on the quality side. So again, it's near and dear to my heart because I used to be a quality engineer and I would have to write RCAs all the time. And typically, when I'm doing these RCAs, after doing my initial round of interviews, I basically know what the problem is. I know it's like one of these three things, and I know I need to solve for these three things, and I want to write them down. But what happens is that you spend an enormous amount of time documenting information for two reasons. The first reason is it you want to have the historical information. So if you have the issue in 3 years, you have a reference point that you can actually learn from it. And then the other thing is you need to convince other people internally in the organization that your conclusion is correct. But typically they basically already know. So if you can automate the creation of some of that information, so I'm not saying you don't need quality engineers. I'm saying that if a quality engineer says, hey, I just need some help generating some ideas on what the corrective actions could be off of this root cause, you can use that for brainstorming. You can use it to generate like a very comprehensive set of things that you can go execute, and you can do it very, very quickly. So I wish I had this type of technology when I was a quality engineer because I would have been able to add much more value to the organization much faster because I'm not bogged down in being like, okay, what did I do all of my five whys? Did I like fill out everything on the fishbone diagram? You can use the technology to help you get there way quicker. And so those are the types of things that are simple and
Mhm.
easy to deploy use cases that also drive a lot of value. Does that make sense?
Well, it really does. We're talking a lot about the benefits, right? But there's two sides to every coin. Any
Mm.
besides security, any risks in leveraging generative AI from your perspective? Any
Yeah.
downside?
So let's talk about the risk of what I was just talking about. So say you're a
Mhm,
quality engineer
mhm.
and there is a risk of someone just relying on whatever the output of the AI tool is. They effectively turn off their brain. We work with some engineering firms, consulting engineering firms, and this is something we've had to have a lot of conversations about because they were talking about like building engineering reports that are customer facing for this client, right? So they generate this report, but there's still professional engineers on staff. Those professional engineers still have to stamp that document. They still have to review it, but there is this risk of engineers inside of an organization turning their brain off and being like, well, the AI said it, so it must be true. So organizations really need to do a lot of training to make sure that they know that this is a tool, it's not the end product. You still need to have your subject matter expertise look at all of these things that are being built. It's just like anything else. It doesn't fully replace a person. And in my perspective, it likely never will. You will still need subject matter experts to take a look at any output of these tools. It's just, can you get there way faster? So that's the biggest risk that I see just on like how it works inside of an organization, putting the security stuff aside.
Yeah, I know definitely that's one of the things that has been discussed with using Chat GPT, which, like you said, it goes out and scrapes the internet. We know everything that's on the internet is not necessarily true. If you rely on that and don't check your sources before moving forward, you put yourself at risk. But to your point, even if it's your own information, does it really line up? Does it make sense? Is it represented the way that you would represent it as an engineer? So that's a really good point. We focus a lot on benefits, but I think it's always wise to kind of take a critical look at things and ask yourself, is there a risk in this? Are there things that we need to be aware of, things that we need to avoid or be sure that we plan for? Like you said, having good discussion and training around, don't rely solely on the information without giving it, a once over and using your own perspective and what you know to be true. So that's really good advice. Is there any myth that you would love to bust while you have an audience to listen to it about AI? Is there anything you've been hearing out there that you're like, that's absolutely not true? Is that you want to do some myth busting around AI? Do you have anything like that?
I have a lot. I have a lot. I'm trying to think of the one that I actually want to talk about. So like agents are becoming super popular. People are talking about agents. Actually, that's like its own 60-minute podcast. So maybe we don't even go into the agent world. I think that there's an idea that there's an AI easy button that you just install a magical piece of software inside of a business, and then magically the organization is an AI driven organization. But most people that have worked inside of businesses know that businesses are super complex, right? There's every has their own processes, has their own systems, has their own places that they store data, has their own people, and those things are unique to every, and not only that, has their own products and has their own ways of like building things. And so yes, there are tools that you can install, but there's no tool that you could ever install inside of a manufacturing organization that just will magically know everything about that manufacturing organization. You will have to connect it. There is work associated with it. I do spend a lot of time talking about that AI, though it's really, really powerful, it's certainly not magic. So that's the first thing. There is work to make these things work. And then the second piece of it is, oh, I had something. I forgot what it was going to be, Adrienne. I did. Oh, okay. The idea that AI can just that a magic bullet that can solve most problems. There are tons of tools that are out there. So, though AI can do a lot of things, generative AI specifically can do a lot of things, there are organizations, usually larger organizations, that start with the solution, which is we want to use generative AI, and then they go searching for something to like fit that. So you can either make something that doesn't actually need that, or they just over-engineer something. You're forcing the round peg into a square hole situation. And it's really worth making sure that you understand the problem statement and then go in search of a tool that can solve that problem. Sometimes that's generative AI, but sometimes you just need a piece of software to do what you're doing. Or sometimes you just need a report out of SSRS or Power BI. There are so many tools that can solve a problem that maybe an AI assistant isn't the right solution for. Yeah. So those are, why don't we stop there?
There's many more, I think,
Yes.
and probably more to come, right? Over time, people start, it kind of becomes folklore about, AI and what it can do. But yeah, no, those are good because again, with any technology or anything that's out there, there's going to be some misconceptions or beliefs that this is how it works or this is what it does. And so it's always good to have someone who's more of an expert in this space to demystify some of that and kind of put some of those assumptions to bed. So that's good to know. I guess to close out things, I would just say, any advice that you would offer to someone who is now looking at generative AI or thinking about their organization, how they can gain some efficiency and be more effective? Any advice that you would give if they're kind of at the very beginning stages of even considering this that you'd like to share with listeners?
Yes. So if someone is looking into the technology, it's interesting, and they're not using it themselves, they need to start using it themselves, just on an individual basis. My advice is 15 minutes 3 times a week, literally like putting it on your calendar and saying like, all right, I'm going to try to use this technology to solve an actual problem during this time. So it could be something as simple as I need to write this email, and but using the technology to help you write the email, or I need to write a report, using it to write a report, or you're inside of Excel. I actually used this the other day because I was doing some Excel work and I couldn't figure out a formula, and I was like, oh wait, I can, why don't I just plug this formula into ChatGPT or something like that? I actually use Google Gemini and then see if it can help me troubleshoot why my formula is not working. And it did. Like, I solved my problem probably 3 times faster than I would have had I just like searched on Google and tried to figure it out. So I just encourage, especially leaders, if they're trying to have their organization figure out how to use it, they should really use it themselves, because it'll give them a much better like BS meter as well, of like what it can do and what it can't do.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the practice of prompting it and asking the right
Mhm.
types of questions, right? That exercise alone is a good way to get some practice with it, because it depends on how you ask the question and how deep you want to go as to what you get back, right? And I'm
Yeah.
sure that's true for whether you're using something that's built internally or something that's just a, open type of model as well. But that's a good point. Yeah, that's good advice. Anything else?
Yeah, and the second thing I would say is having some type of structured training. So I know that SEMEP is putting on some workshops, and those workshops are geared for a conceptual understanding of how the technology works. So the more you can demystify what's going on, so it's one thing to have an individual use of the technology, but then when you move to applying it inside of a business, there are specific techniques, and those techniques are evolving and they're getting more intuitive, but at the fundamental level, they're the same, right? So even if the technology gets more and more fancy, but underlying it are these basic concepts. And the more you can understand those basic concepts, like what exactly is fine tuning, what is meant by fine tuning, or there's a concept of something called retrieval augmented generation. Now, a business leader doesn't need to know how to build a retrieval augmented generation system, but if they want to use AI inside of their business, having understanding the concept of what's behind retrieval augmented generation, or RAG is what it's called, helps them understand what's a good use case and what's a not good use case. And it also helps them be more intuitive on when do we need to do that data work, and when is it like, when can we not do it, or what's the heavier lift and what's not. So when they're working with vendors like us, they can have a much better meter on what's feasible for their organization.
No, that's extremely helpful. I'm sure for a lot of people that are just getting started with this, there's just so many questions that they have. So I appreciate you providing some insight around that. I mean, great information even for me, because again, the AI, I play with it some myself, using things like ChatGPT or Gemini. But at the same time, just when you look at the scale of an organization, that's a vastly different thing. And I still don't think that people have their arms around what that really means or how it can be used. And obviously the security around it as well. So really great information. I appreciate you being on the podcast so much. So thank you, Cameron.
Yeah, this was super fun. I hope I encourage people to just really get started. Just try some things, right? It's a muscle that gets built over time, and we see things on the news of people, typically larger organizations, doing really impressive, incredible things with the technology, but they have to start somewhere. And so building your muscle with small projects will make it so that when you're ready, you can take on those large projects and really meet the market demand where it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thanks for joining this episode of the Six M's of Manufacturing podcast. Special thanks to Cameron Duncan for not only sharing insights about the benefits and risks to leveraging AI, but for busting some common myths about this rapidly evolving application. Be sure to visit the episode notes for links and information shared in today's discussion. Did you enjoy this episode? That's awesome. Be sure to follow our podcast and share with your network. And remember, don't just make it better.